Welcome back to the University of Idaho and University of Wyoming Extension Sheep and Goat webinar series. Today, we're going to do things just a little bit different, and I'll explain that in just a second. But I'm Melinda Ellison, and I'm the University of Idaho Extension Sheep Specialist. And you also have, as hosts for this webinar series, Carmen Wilmore, who's an extension educator for the University of Idaho in Lincoln County, and Whit Stewart, who's the University of Wyoming Extension Sheep Specialist. And we bring this webinar to you once a week. We also have all of our updates, events, and various things that we have to offer for you posted to our Facebook pages at UI Sheep and Goats for the University of Idaho, and the University of Wyoming is at UW Sheep. You can also catch all of the webinars later on if you join our YouTube channel, University of Idaho Extension Livestock channel. Today, we're going to talk about different winter feeding strategies as we're moving into winter right now. We are gearing up for feeding. In fact, I've already been feeding for about 3 weeks. I just don't have the pasture to go into the fall. And so the biggest thing for me is making sure that we all understand how the animals' requirements change throughout the winter, and different types of animals and different classes and stages of their life, and how those things look, and then also a few other pieces of information. So obviously, this is the easy part. You guys all know what you have, how many mature ewes and does you might have. The biggest thing here is having a decent understanding of the average of the body weights in your herd. And so if you have a bunch of mature ewes that range quite a bit in their body weight, or maybe they're really similar in body weight, but if you can get a good understanding of where you lay on that level, that's really important when it comes to feeding. Also, you want to have a good idea of when you started breeding, how long your gestation is going to last, and that type of thing, so that you can start adjusting your feeding as you go through the winter while the animals are changing from early to late gestation and transitioning from parturition into lactation. Of course, you want to know when you can expect to have lambs and kids dropping. That's important from a feeding standpoint as well as just a management standpoint, of course. So the other thing that I think, and as we go through, you'll see why, but one of the things that we don't do well at in general as an industry is determining how many offspring that the animals are going to have. And of course, that's going to take a vet coming and doing an ultrasound on your animals to give you an idea of how many you can expect from each individual animal. And I understand there's a lot of times that the cost of that or the management implications of that are just not feasible for certain people. And so obviously with a grain of salt and whatever fits your operation is the most important. But the other thing is, I'm sure you have your mature rams and bucks, and as you go into winter, those guys aren't doing a whole lot. They're just going to maintain through the winter. You also have your replacement animals. If you kept some ewe lambs and you're breeding them, the biggest thing to make sure to remember here is that you have to feed them for maintenance and whatever they're doing, whether it's gestating or lactating, but also you have to remember that they are also growing in addition to all of that. So they're going to require higher inputs as far as feed goes than your mature animals. And I put on here finishing lambs. At my operation, I finish lambs, but I'm not going to get into that in too much detail today because that's a whole nother conversation. So I'm mostly going to just talk about the animals that you'll keep year round and what you'll do to feed them through the winter. Let's talk about first, how much feed do we give our animals? The biggest thing to remember here is that they will only eat as much as they can eat. So at the end of the day, if you try to feed them 5 pounds and they only will eat 2.5 pounds, that's just all they're going to eat, right? So the biggest thing to remember is just feed them as much as they're going to eat. And if the feed is not good enough quality, you can't just feed more to make up for it. You have to get feed that is the right nutrient quality for your animals. Okay, so if you're not going to do anything else besides just calculating the average of the animals and how much they're going to eat, the rule of thumb here is if they're not gestating or lactating, hit them with 2.5% of their body weight to do maintenance feeding. And if they are gestating and lactating, 3% of their body weight will probably meet the needs. But at the end of the day, as like I said a minute ago, if the feed is poor quality, it doesn't matter how much you give them because they're only going to be able to eat as much as they can eat. So I built this table and I adapted it from a book called the NRC, Nutrient Requirements of Small Ruminants. And I just wanted to point some things out to you guys. So this one's for sheep. I have another table that's for goats, but this is mature ewes. So this doesn't include anything that would still be growing. And we have maintenance, early gestation, late gestation, and early lactation. Down here along the left side, this is the body weight. So they were adjusted from kilograms, and so that's why the numbers are a little bit funky. But as you can see, the percentage of body weight that they will eat at that stage in life will be the left column, and the pounds of feed per day will be in your right column. So during maintenance, you calculate approximately 2% of their body weight, and you'll hit these levels when nothing else is going on and they're just maintaining their selves. As we move into early gestation, things change a little bit. And here you can see there's going to be ranges, and that's going to be how many lambs, or in the next chart, how many kids that animal is carrying. So you'll calculate as they move forward in gestation a little bit more feed. So that can range anywhere from 2% of their body weight to 3%, depending on how many lambs that they're carrying. So at this point, you can see where if you were only feeding 2.5 pounds a day, maybe 3, you would start to not have enough for some of those ewes that are carrying triplets, because these animals are going to need up to 4 or 5 pounds a day of whatever feed it is to meet their requirements. And again, as we move forward, late gestation, we're increasing. And just note here that these animals, like compared to cattle or something of that nature, sheep and goats really do start really low in their maintenance requirements as far as how much they need to intake, how many nutrients they're going to need. And as they start gestating, they really shoot up. So if you're having a 200-pound ewe that's going to produce triplets, and if she's lactating, you're going to have to feed her over 7 pounds of feed per day. So you can see where having that separation of different animals, having twins or singles or triplets or whatever it may be, is going to really benefit you as far as not underfeeding certain animals, and of course not overfeeding. So if you're calculating an average of 7 pounds a day, because that's what's going to take to meet the highest requirements possible, these animals are getting way more than they need. So if you were to separate them by body weight or by the number of lambs that they're going to have, it's going to make a big impact on your feed bill. So moving down to, this is non-dairy does. So assume that the feed is going to be a lot higher for dairy goats. And I will post these to our Facebook page, this PDF, so you guys have access to it. But I'll also show you where you can find some of these values here in a minute. So goats, the same way, they have a little bit higher intake than sheep in their maintenance, but they similarly will move up across the board as they're gestating, and as they have those kids and start lactating, you're going to see a big boost in how much they need to eat and what percentage of their body weight that they need to eat. I have a question about doing an example of hay and corn breakdown using these charts, and I will get to that in just a minute. Robert, so hang tight there for a second. So now we've identified what we have for animals and how much they're probably going to need, which is important as you're purchasing hay, of course, because you have to purchase enough to get through the winter. So probably most of you are primarily feeding a grass hay or an alfalfa hay or some kind of mix, would be my guess. If you're not, let me know. But that's what I see a lot of for the most part. Some people will supplement with grain or range cube or something of that nature. I should have asked a question about how you decide what type of supplement you use, but we'll get into some of that in a minute as well. Minerals are really important, and as we move through here, I'm not going to get into a really detailed mineral discussion. We've already had one of those webinars, so make sure you look back if you're interested in the minerals that these animals need and toxicities that can occur and that type of thing. That would be one of the earlier webinars that I did that's posted to our YouTube channel. But minerals are super important, especially when you're gestating and lactating. You can cause a lot of really weird stuff by having an imbalance there. So I will discuss how you can make sure that you're meeting your mineral requirements here in a minute, but not in as much detail as we've talked about before. Also, white salt, just give it to them free choice. They cannot overdose on salt. So it's a self-limiter situation, and you'll be able to make sure that they're having what they need in salt intake. And it also improves their water intake, which is really important as well. So a lot of you mentioned that you don't do nutrient quality analysis of your feeds. And I know sometimes I have been a hypocrite for a long time. In the last few years, I do get my feed tested, and I'm going to show you an example of the feed that I got tested this fall so that you get an idea of what you're looking at when you get the results back. But there's really no way to know if the grass is super green or the grass hay is super green and it looks beautiful. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's a good quality grass. So make sure that if there's any way you can borrow a hay core sampler from your local extension office. I've had a few people that I've worked with to get that done, and it's been a pretty smooth process. I personally send mine to Ward Laboratories, and you can also look back at some of the webinars that we've done with Rebecca Kern to talk in more detail about these things. But there's all kinds of feed analysis labs. It costs $20 or maybe a little less per sample. And at the end of the day, if you get a hay that is really poor quality and your animals start to fall off come January or February, right before lambing and kidding, you're going to have some major trouble bringing them back. And you are going to probably end up spending a heck of a lot more than that to try to get these animals to increase body weight in the middle of winter while they're gestating. So just make sure that if it's at all possible, it's really important. And that way you just know that you're giving them what they need and that you're covering all your bases. So like I said, you can go back to some of the webinars we've done on this before, but you get this hay core sampler from your local extension office. Probably some of the NRCS offices have one as well. You separate all of your hay into lots, which is essentially means a group of hay that came from one field, or maybe this year's hay, or maybe the cuttings were a little bit different across a couple weeks. Just make sure it's pretty representative of what it is that you're testing. And you want to test every year. Just because you raise hay on your same property every year, things can change a lot across years. Like this year being such a dry year, I imagine the hay quality is a little bit lower this year than it is some years. So just something to think about there. And sample 20% of bales within each lot. and that'll give you a good representative idea of what your hay quality is. I'm going to pause here. I have a couple questions. So this question about hay and beans, I'm going to cover that in a second because we're going to talk about that in a minute. Hay sells fast, and by the time I get the sample, the hay is gone. I understand that being a problem. I think the biggest thing there is do your best to find hay that looks pretty green, looks good, get it tested, and then if it ends up being terribly poor quality, you're going to need to supplement with something else. So we'll talk about what that's going to look like, but you do have a right as a buyer to ask for an analysis of the quality. So it's just a balance of being able to find hay, I guess, and being able to get good quality hay. But certainly the biggest thing here in my mind is that you know what the hay that you have, you understand what the nutrient quality is, so that when you're feeding it to your animals, you can supplement if you need to. And what would you suggest the sample is taken? Oh, when would you take the sample? So the biggest thing with sampling is if you're going to do it when it's convenient. If you want to get really nitpicky and be as accurate as possible, test it right before you're going to feed it. And we'll talk about this in a minute, but storing hay can decrease the quality of the hay to some degree, especially if it's not stored under a roof or under a tarp, up off the ground, etc. So storing hay is really important as well. If you've got it stored really well and things are looking pretty good as far as not having a lot of moisture getting on it and animals getting in it and that type of thing, testing it in the fall and feeding it in January is going to be pretty similar as far as the nutrient quality goes. So when you get your test back, obviously best case scenario is you would do a ration balancer, which I will show you guys how to find in a minute. But the two main indicators that you're looking at are crude protein and total digestible nutrients. So crude protein is the protein content in the feed, obviously. And the total digestible nutrients, or the TDN, is going to be a representative of the energy that's in the feed. So of course, to be able to maintain or grow or make a baby or lactate, you need both energy and protein. So these are the two. If this is the only thing you're going to do these two. So, and the reason that it's so important is because that grass hay that we were talking about can look really pretty, but it can range anywhere from 7 to 18% crude protein. Alfalfa, on the other hand, is always, for the most part, if it's put up reasonably well, going to be pretty high protein, 15% or greater usually. But sometimes the TDN isn't adequate in that one. So that's why we need to know what we have in these feeds so that we can make up for any inadequacies that we have. Again, these other values that you're going to be looking at when you get your feed analysis back, these are all things that you could include when you balance a ration or when you make sure that it meets the animal requirements. But it just depends on what level that you would like to go to when you're making sure of what you have. So I just switched over here to, here's an example of the hay that I tested this fall. It's mostly alfalfa. There's a little grass mixed in. And how you read this is, here's the only two things that matter on the left-hand column. So what this is indicating is that 90% of this hay is dry and 10% of this hay is water. So when we look at all the nutrients, we look at it on a dry matter basis. So whatever all of these are, they are a percentage of the dry portion of that hay. The reason being, water does not provide nutrients to your animals. When you're feeding, you're also going to be feeding on this dry matter basis as far as the pounds that they need. As far as hay goes, obviously, when you're within 10% of being mostly dry, it's not going to make as big of an impact. But if you are feeding some kind of wet feeds like a distiller's grain, or if they're out grazing on pasture in the summer, these numbers are going to be a lot bigger of a split. And so the nutrients are only coming from that dry portion of the feed and not the wet portion. So hopefully that makes sense. This particular hay has 19% crude protein, which is really high. Being an alfalfa, it's not surprising. And then, of course, there's all these other values that we can talk about at some point if you're interested in getting in more detail. But the one that you would look for TDN is right here. So this value for TDN is 67, okay? So now if you go and you send your hay in, you have your analysis back, now you have to figure out how much your animals need. So this, I'm gonna get into in a minute. It's as simple as, if you're really into this and you want to get better at balancing rations and meeting nutrient requirements, this NRC of small ruminants is the book that I use. This is the book. It has pages and pages of different classes of animals, what their requirements are. It also has several pages of average quality for different types of feeds. So if you're one of these people that doesn't want to send in your feed, or you don't have time, or you just don't want to do it, you can estimate using these average values that are found in the in this book. So again, this is a little bit spendy of a book, but I use it all the time. So if you want to get into that a little bit more, this is a great one to use. The other thing that you can do that's super easy is to just Google nutrient requirements of goats or nutrient requirements of sheep, and you can pop into any of these. A lot of these are going to be, you know, extension pages or some kind of animal health pages, and you can scroll down and they show you these tables. So I put together this table based on the book, the NRC book. So one thing to remember when you're looking at these tables, a lot of times, because we as scientists have to be confusing, a lot of these are going to be reported as kilograms when you look them up online or in the NRC. So just remember that if you need to convert them, 1 kilogram is 2.2 pounds. Also, they might report them in kilograms per day that are required. All you have to do there is take the kilograms of protein divided by the total intake that they suggest in kilograms, and that'll give you the percent. So this table I put together to show you guys how these things change over time and across body weights. So again, it's the same thing that we look back and we remember that during maintenance, sheep were eating just shy of 2 pounds per day of feed. Of that feed, they need to have at least 7% crude protein and at least 53% TDN. So if you remember this feed, if we needed 53, 67 is way more than you would need. And if we needed 7% crude protein, I'm more than doubling the protein needs of my sheep if this is the only hay that I feed. So now you can understand that having these results back, what I'm going to be doing is feeding a heck of a lot of expensive hay to these sheep that they don't need when they're in maintenance, right? I could cut it with something a little bit less protein heavy and make sure that they are not costing me an arm and a leg in really good quality feed when that's not really what they need during maintenance. However, if you start looking through the different gestation stages and lactation, we see that their crude protein goes 7 to 8 to 10 to 12 and maxes out for these smaller ewes that might be carrying triplets at 20%. So 19.5%, looking back at this crude protein, if all of my tiny little 88-pound ewes are carrying triplets, this is close, but it doesn't quite meet my protein requirements. Okay. If I have ewes that are anywhere from 88 to 132 pounds and they're carrying triplets, they need 80% TDN. And that is where this feed is going to fall flat. So with ruminants, TDN is one of those things that is actually pretty decent in a grass hay, because sheep and goats can digest fiber to get energy. So sometimes in those stemmy grass hays, your TDN is going to help you out. So if you did a balance between giving them the protein they need with this alfalfa, but then also supplementing with some of the grass hay, and this is where balancing multiple feeds is going to be really important, because you're not going to be hitting the mark in some cases. A lot of times, 80% TDN, you're going to need to find an energy supplement, a grain of some kind, to bump that energy as well in some of those ewes that are carrying triplets. So it's just something to keep in mind, and it gives you guys an idea how different requirements from different animals, depending on what's happening in their bodies. It's pretty amazing, really. And I made a chart that's for goats as well. Same situation. For whatever reason, these, I guess it's not for whatever reason, it seems pretty obvious to me, I guess, that these little does and ewes, if they're carrying triplets, they just need a lot of extra to make sure that those lambs and kids are getting what they need. So as we're, nearing the end of gestation, just be really cognizant that you're supplying them with everything that they need as they're going into the end of gestation and starting lactation. And goats, you'll notice they do not require quite as high of a TDN as sheep do. And that is because of the nature of their digestive system. Goats are much better at digesting that fiber and some of the other, because they're going to eat stemmy browse and that kind of thing. They're just really good at utilizing the energy that they're eating. So just so you guys are aware of that. So this is getting into some of the questions that you guys have asked, and I'll look back at those at the end and make sure that we answer the specifics. Here's how you might take a couple of different feeds and balance them. So to me, the best option is using a ration balancer. That's, and it's free. I'm going to show you the one that I use. You can also set up an Excel file so that you can do different weighted equations if you're handy at Excel. And the other thing is to just crunch it out by hand. And so here's the equations. You can plug them into whatever program or Excel or on paper that works for you, depending on how math oriented you are. But essentially what you do is you go back up, you take the total feed required by whatever animal it is that you're balancing the ration for. So let's just assume it was that 200-pound ewe that was having triplets. She needs 7 pounds of feed, right? And then you plug in her protein requirement, which you can look back up here. If she's having triplets, she needs 13.5%. Okay, so then you take the grass hay that you had tested and you plug in the percent protein that it had, and then you plug in the alfalfa hay that was tested and the percent protein there, and you can start manipulating this equation to say how many pounds of alfalfa hay plus grass hay is going to equal the requirement that I need. There may come a point that you just can't get there, right? and you need to add another protein supplement into this equation. So this is where making sure that you are actually doing the balancing and calculating what you need to feed them is going to be important. And I can't be the only one, and I'll admit it, that I've had a couple of ewes that have come out of gestation in really tough shape. And then inevitably it falls on her lambs as they're growing. They just don't grow as well as the other lambs. And then they have problems when they're lambing. And it's a cycle that we can get ahead of by just making sure they have what they need in the beginning. Same goes if you calculate this for crude protein, make sure that you're also meeting your TDN requirements. And now you can see where having a ration balancer can be helpful, right? Because trying to even do just these two things and making sure that they fit, and maybe you want to add fat in there, and you want to know how your minerals look and that kind of thing. This is where going on to that ration balancer is going to be helpful. So let me pull up this other. Okay, so now I'm going to show you this sheep ration balancing program. It's free for sheep. I've got a list of ones for sheep and goats. If you guys are interested and you want one that's going to fit your needs the closest, I will go ahead and help you out with that if you want to shoot me an email. I have my email on the other page when we get back to it if you want to jot it down, and I'm happy to help with any of this that you guys might need. So this ration balancing program for the sheep side is really handy because you can come in. There's a big feed library that tells you estimates for what feeds normally fall at as far as nutrient quality. You can also enter custom feed. Oh, I'm sorry, I wasn't logged in. Here, when you get the feed analysis back from the laboratory, you can put a unique name to it. You can even add in the price, so you can do a economic analysis of the feed that you're using as well. But you plug in the dry matter value, which was the 90%, if you remember from that page that I showed you guys. The TDN, I think was 67 or something of that nature. Protein was 19. And then there's all these other values that come on that analysis that you can plug into these different boxes, and then you save that value. Then when you go, you can look at the requirements of your animals. You can choose any of these options and it'll tell you what the requirements are. So you don't even have to Google or buy an NRC book. Here it is for free for you to just look at it anytime. The balancer is the neat thing. If I balance a diet ration for my ewes, I can come in here and here's the alfalfa that I had tested that I showed you guys, plug it in there, and it tells me all the values that I got from that feed analysis. So at this point, you can select, okay, I'm gonna say, I want to have my ewes, they're at the end of gestation, most of them are gonna be twins. They are 132 pounds. Ration name. You can see that I've already done this once with my sheep. So you plug in your feed, and now down here at the bottom, hopefully you guys can see it. It's saying that if I feed them 1 pound of feed, that's 25% of their requirements as far as how much feed they're eating. It's meeting protein about 43%. So what you want to do then is, let's see, the late gestation, I don't remember exactly how much that was on the chart, but let's just say it was 4 pounds just for the sake of looking at this. So at this point, I'm feeding 4 pounds of the alfalfa that I showed you guys. It is meeting protein by 170%. That's way more than they need if I'm solely feeding alfalfa, but it's meeting my TDN by about 100%. So what ends up happening here is if I give them a grass hay also, I can meet this 100% by balancing the ration and also not overfeeding them protein and costing myself money. So if you can imagine, I paid a lot more for the alfalfa hay than I probably paid for my grass hay in some cases. And so you can see that that might save you some money to balance in some grass. Okay. Now let me switch back to this guy. So again, here's my contact information. I do this all the time, so it's really simple for me to get through. I don't mind helping you guys at any time, sheep or goats. And I can set you up with a more comprehensive walkthrough of the Ration Balancer if you really want to get into this. So don't hesitate if you guys are interested. If you would like, I'm happy to help you whether you get your hay tested or not. I can try to give you an estimate. Obviously, the best case scenario is for you to get your hay tested and then come to me. But let's work together regardless, because I think this is really important, and hopefully I've hit home just how important it is, especially for those girls producing 2, 3, 4, however many offspring, to make sure that they're getting what they need and giving those lambs and kids a good start, especially, but not losing too much condition on your ewes. So of course, it's not that easy, is it? Never is. The other thing to make sure that you're doing is adjusting for waste. This is going to happen. Sheep, cattle, goats, whoever, they are very disgusting critters sometimes. So make sure that you're including some feed, whether you calculate 10 or 20% based on your scenario, it's going to differ, just on waste that's going to occur. So for example, I just started feeding out my lambs that will go to the butcher in December, and I'm feeding them solely that fancy alfalfa hay that they're getting way more than they need in protein, et cetera, et cetera. And it's delicious and little leaves that they love, and they're still wasting a good 10% of that just by not wanting to pick it up off the ground. Selectivity is a big one for that. So anything that they don't want, they're going to leave, especially if they have the option. And I'll tell you what, I had a year that I bought some hay and I didn't get it tested. It was fine cow hay because it was all tall grass. I don't think it would have hurt a thing, but as my ewes started to get into gestation, I also was having a liver fluke problem. And those girls could just not keep up with what I was feeding them. And they were eating twice as much, it seemed, than they should have been. And they just didn't do well that year. So this is why it's not only important to test your hay and make sure you have what you think you have, but those girls just wouldn't eat it. They would not eat some of it, and they just left it. And it's like, I'm feeding you what you need, the amount that you need, but you won't eat it. So it was a good lesson for me to find out that sheep especially will literally starve themselves if they don't like what you give them. So it's just something to keep in mind. If you're having half of the hay that you feed them being left on the ground, your hay is probably not the best quality for sheep. The other thing is anytime they walk on it, poop on it, urinate on it, use it for bedding, all of these things, they're not going to go back and eat it later. So this is where feeding them the appropriate amount for how much they're going to need to eat, plus a little bit of waste, is the best option, because if you're overfeeding them, they're going to waste a lot more just through these sort of activities. There's been a few questions about separating. The biggest thing is if you can't separate the animals, and I understand that, you don't always have all the pens that you need or the space that you need. Just make sure that they're not super crowded if you're going to feed them all together, because for one, your older animals are going to beat out your younger animals for feed, and the younger animals are the ones that need the most. So make sure they have a lot of space. Determine the average of all the different animals in the group. So if you have 20 mature ewes and 10 replacement ewes or whatever it may be, just make sure that you're giving all the different groups enough to get what they need. If you're feeling like you don't have a good estimate, just aim high. If you can't separate them, you may end up feeding more than you need to, but it's better to give them what they need than not give them enough. So at this point, this is the most important time to know that the nutrients are going to fit the requirements, and then just give them a little extra. So that would be my recommendation. We can certainly get together and discuss options for your specific operation when it comes to crowd feeding. But if you do have the opportunity to separate, the cost of feeding them all together is going to automatically just be a little bit higher just because of the way that it is. So we already had that question. If you can separate the animals that have huge differences in nutrient requirements, like ewes and does that have singles versus ones with triplets or more, anything that's growing, give them an extra pen, extra feed to make sure that they're meeting all their requirements. And this is probably mostly a given, but your rams and your bucks, they don't need much. They just need their maintenance diet. Putting them in here, they're going to beat out a bunch of the other animals. They're going to eat a lot more than they need. And so I would recommend keeping them separate. And not only just from a feed standpoint, but having issues with the lambs. So I'm getting a little short on time and I want to make sure that I have time for questions, but just think about where you're feeding. If you're feeding on the ground, you're probably having more waste. We talked about that. If you're feeding on the ground and there's a lot of defecation and urination and bedding and that type of thing going on, you are going to increase your risk of spreading disease. So you want to try to rotate where you're feeding so that you're in cleaner areas every day. Make sure you clean your bunks and have the appropriate feeding. I was going to show you guys one more place that you can find some good information. So again, just Google, plans for a sheep feeder, or plans for this, that, or the other. But this LSU Ag Center there's some other places that do similar things, but you can go down through here and they've got plans for different feeders and lambing units and working facilities and that type of thing, so you can get the right dimensions on everything. And I apologize, it's not pulling up here, but you can build all of these things for pretty little money. So it's probably worth at least taking a look at these, and if you're handy at all, but all of these things can also be purchased if that's more your style. So we can talk in more detail based on your specific operation about which one is the best for you, but just make sure that you have the right feeding equipment. When you're feeding mineral, make sure they're not eating way more than they need, keeping your mineral out of the elements and everything. Again, provide salt all the time to them. Give them clean water available to them all the time, especially during gestating and lactating, when water is going to make a huge difference in how they perform. Also, if you can put a tank heater or something in the water, the warmer temperatures of water will help increase their intake. And any sort of running water is also good for that. It'll stay warmer. Your choice on when you feed. The one thing I wanted to point out was that if you're getting ready to lamb or kid, if you feed those critters in the evenings, it will encourage them to lamb or kid in the daytime. So that's always nice. There is some scientific evidence that works. And from personal experience, I also always feed my critters in the evening when I'm lambing, so that I mostly get them dropping in the morning. So and the last but not least, we talked about it for a second, is just to make sure that you're storing your feed in a way that minimizes exposure to the elements, moisture, other critters. Rodents are possible disease carriers for sheep. So make sure you try to keep those guys out, keep it up off the ground to decrease mold, that type of thing. Just something to think about. But as you have more exposure to these various things, your hay can start to lose some of its quality and palatability. And then you're going to end up not having what your animals need and also not getting them to clean it up like they should. So I'm going to roll back up here because we may have questions about some of these tables, but I'm going to pull up some of the questions that you guys have. Again, if you guys want to raise your hand, I'll take any in-person questions, or you can say them out loud. And I'll just try to get back. So this question about providing a vitamin supplement when purchasing hay by cost rather than quality. I still think we should go back to the age-old question, is the hay good quality or not? So for me, some of these supplements may be a waste of your money, especially if you look at these maintenance values for the animals. 7% crude protein during maintenance is actually a pretty low quality grass hay. So I think it kind of depends a lot on what stage of their life cycle that they're in. And remember that these are mature animals. Your growing animals are obviously going to need a boost of all these things, but I think it's important to just know what you have. So getting your hay tested, I can help set you up with an avenue there. So going back to this question about beans, this question says that she feeds alfalfa hay that tests between 14 and 18% protein, and also going to feed some beans, and what my experience might be with the beans. I do not specifically have any experience feeding beans to goats, especially because I'm not a goat person, but sheep either. I've never lived in a place where we had too much farming going on where that was an option for me. I would say that it's likely going to be fine. I think it would still be worth making sure you test the beans to make sure you have an idea of what's in them. Because my suspicion is that because of how well the alfalfa hay is testing, if beans are not low quality, which I suspect they're not, you might just be overdoing it as far as what their requirements are. So I can't really answer that without looking at the values, the book values, to make sure, but okay. The question about sorting according to ultrasound. To be fair, I do ultrasound for pregnancy testing, but I do not sort them during gestation by how many lambs that they have. The reason being is my sheep typically only have 1 or 2 lambs, and so I feed them in a way that they are all having twins. That's just how I deal with it. I do separate my lambs and use after they are born, because I think it's important, especially with the sheep, when they start lactating, they have another bump in requirements that you just don't really need to feed to all the gestating ewes if they're not lactating yet. This is a question about using feeders and finding hay left in nearly every day, and whether or not it's overfeeding. So they have access to grass and get apples from the orchard, and I feed a grain mix. So my guess is with that one, they're probably being selective more so than anything, or maybe you're giving them a little more feed than they can handle in a day. So I think that especially in your scenario, Chris, where you have other options for them that they can pick up whenever they want, it's probably worth just feeding them as much as they'll clean up, is what I would do if I were in that scenario. But the other option is that it just may not be very palatable. So especially given that they have apples and that type of thing, grain, those things are definitely going to outcompete any grass hay. What is a good way to determine how many pounds of hay you are feeding? Flake size versus round bales can vary. So what I do, and I understand the variation, I feed large squares. I have a hay scale, and I just try to estimate how much each flake weighs. As far as round bales, I mean, the best option is if you get one of those platform scales that you can maybe do like a tub or something that you can put the hay in if you want to measure every day. Sometimes it's just a matter of getting a feel for how much is in a pitchfork. I think it's just kind of being creative on that scenario, because I understand that it's kind of hard to weigh every single day. But that's what I would do, is either do a hanging hay scale and put some in a tarp and hang it to see where you're at, or a flat scale and put a bucket out there that you can fill up. Let's see. As far as a recording of this presentation, yes, I will put it on YouTube probably tomorrow, so you can access it there. I'm also going to put the PDF on our Facebook page, and link it there so you guys have it. Okay. So the hay and corn breakdown, Robert, that you asked for, I don't have the values for corn sitting in front of me. One thing I will caution you about with just a grass hay and corn, you're likely going to run into a lack of protein. Corn doesn't have a lot of protein in it. If you're comfortable with weighted equations, it's just an average of how much you're feeding and what the percentage of protein is in those feeds. I would say that you're not going to meet requirements of protein in those late gestation and early lactation stages without adding some kind of protein supplement. We can certainly work on that a little bit more in person through email or on the phone or whatever, if you would like to. So just hit me up if that's what you want to do. Question about range cube protein blocks. If any of you guys, especially in Idaho, have a place that you purchase protein blocks for your, or protein cubes for your sheep or goats, if you guys could link that to me via email for this person, I think that would help her out a lot. That's one thing in various places. It's sometimes hard to find supplements that are cost effective. So I'm always open to hearing where you guys are getting your various supplements, protein or energy, and how you're purchasing them in bulk or what's happening there. So feel free to fill me in on that if you guys would like to. So this question is regarding mature does and 6 to 12 month doelings. Asking if limiting hay, the bullies just eat it all and the timid goats would starve. So the biggest thing there is two options. If you have a scenario where you're feeding all your animals together and you're having trouble with bullies pushing other animals around, I would say either do a better job of spreading the feed out so that the timid animals can get away, or do your best to separate them. And see, this is an age-old conundrum for feeding critters is, you know, these probably these timid goats that are having trouble fighting off the bullies are probably your younger animals, and they are the ones that probably need more of the feed. So I would install another feeder across the pen. Just try to get them spread out a little bit if there's no option for separating them. But if there is an option, even just putting a fence down the middle of the existing pen, just try to do it that way. Okay. So as far as balancing, this question is asking about bigger ewes getting more of the energy feeds or the grains and how we can balance out access to nutrients. So again, you really want to try to give them enough spacing. There are some recommendations on that. I believe for adult mature ewes, you want to give them, 4 feet of space in the bunk that they can linearly have for themselves. That decreases some of the chances. My guess is the feeder that you have is not big enough for the number of animals that you're feeding. Always put the hay down first if you're mixing hay and grain, and put the grain on top. That will help them be able to reach it quicker. But I would say the biggest challenge when you're feeding them all together is making sure they have that space, because especially when you have that bully scenario, you've got to give the other ones a chance to get in there. The other option would be if you're watching your animals and you're identifying 1 or 2 animals that are really being the bullies. If you've got a small pen that you could separate them into, that may help relieve some of that. In California, we have winter rye and some other browse all winter long. How do you take that into account? So winter browse is great. It's a great option. You're almost always in that scenario going to have enough fiber coming in that your TDN hopefully will be met. Your limiting factor there will be protein. So I would recommend the same thing. Go out and clip a few samples from your winter browse and get it sent in. And that'll give you a good idea of whether or not they're getting enough protein and energy from those feeds. But if they're browsing all winter, the most common way to balance that out is to provide some kind of protein supplement. Typically feed high quality alfalfa and supplement with grain for pregnancy and lactation. I definitely don't fault that at all. The biggest thing there is it's entirely possible that you are giving them more feed than they need. So that's not a bad thing if you can afford to do it. But if you want to get to a closer evaluation of how you're feeding, we can certainly do a balance on that ration and make sure that it's what it should be. So we have feeding grass hay and want to try peas, oats, or triticale vetch. Is there a way to better estimate the future hay or decide what to try for future hay plantings? So this is where if you, you can Google it, or again, it's in the NRC book of just nutrient quality of the different kinds of plants. You can get an idea of what those nutrients are going to look like when you get that hay put up. So there's usually some kind of estimated value that you can plug in for trying to look into the future a little bit. Details on how and where to sample the hay. We did, it's probably been about a month and a half ago. Go to our YouTube channel or the Facebook page. So the YouTube channel is University of Idaho Extension Livestock, or our Facebook page is at UI Sheep and Goats. We have a webinar that is entirely focused on how to sample hay and how to, and where to send it. So make sure you check that out if you want to have more information on that. There's a question on, is there a health risk in having too much protein in a ration? It depends on how much. I mean, it doesn't hurt to have extra protein. All that it's doing is working its way through the system and just not being utilized. So I would say in most cases, when you have a high protein diet, there's probably potentially some other side effects. Like, for example, if you do distiller's grains, you may have concerns with high sulfur. So specific to garbanzo beans, I don't know enough about those specifically right offhand. We could look into it, but just do a quick Google search when you're feeding those things about possible toxicities, because there are, in those really high protein feeds, possible other things that could happen other than just being too much protein. So this question on soy whole pellets, I cannot remember what Rebecca said, but in that same webinar regarding sampling hay for feeding, she spoke specifically on that. And I don't have those in my area, so I apologize that I don't remember what her comment on those were, but look back on that or shoot me an email and I can get an answer for you about soy whole pellets. Okay. Currently feeding Free Choice barley straw, 2 pounds of alfalfa hay plus half whole corn and Free Choice Crystallix. So this one, I would love to balance this for you. Will you please, Scott, send me an email with these values in it so that I can plug them in? I can't answer that off the top of my head. I'm going to have to put it in my Ration Balancer, but I can definitely help you with that. Scott also mentioned that Cache Commodity and Cache Junction, Utah has all types of protein blocks and pellets. So Janice, I think you were the one that asked about that. Cache Junction, Utah. Okay, so I don't see any more questions. I appreciate you guys sticking with me through this. I know it was kind of a long topic, but I'm really excited about all the questions you guys asked. And again, my email, ellison@uidaho.edu. I love to balance rations. So hit me up, I'll help you. We'll get your sheep and goats on the right path for this winter. And I can help you guys with whatever questions you have and help you learn how to balance your own rations if you would like to, and set you up with somewhere to get your feed tested and all of that. So also, if you have any comments about this specific webinar, how we can change things to make it more fun for you guys. And also, if I can talk about this topic in a different way that might be helpful, I always want your feedback. So just let me know. And next week, we will have Brett Taylor from the U.S. Sheep Experiment Station, and he's going to visit about some of the lambing facilities that they have and what works and what doesn't, and give you guys some information there. Thanks, guys. We'll talk to you soon.